I think we're gonna get started, and we have a full agenda, and to justify the agenda, in part, today was announced by, what's his name, Lighthizer, the trade rep of the U.S., that indeed tomorrow he will present, the Trump administration will present the negotiation idea to the Congress, right? So it'll start, as per U.S. law, it'll be 90 days, and then they'll start full negotiations. And the question is, will they be able to finish this before the end of the year? That's a cool question we may want to revisit later. So Nafta is hot. It's a new Nafta debate. I mean, many of us have been following the story for 20 years in my case, and others for longer, because it was not before Nafta. We had various attempts at bringing closer economic relations one way or another between the U.S. and Latin America, and those things yielded no fruits or very little fruit or some fruits. And then, of course, after Nafta, we had the Free Trade of the Americas, which we should revisit at some point in Zadia, right? The Free Trade of the Americas, what did that fail later after NAFTA? The FTAA, right? Mm-hmm. And then later we have the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which again, we backed out of that whole thing. So it's a tango Apache situation where the dancers seem to be throwing away the partner, and they go back and dancing and what have you. But in one case, it was Brazil, and actually in 2003, with the Free Trade FTAA, and now it is us, U.S., with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, and who knows what's going to happen to NAFTA, because behind the idea of negotiating, we have threats. Unless we do this according to Roy Washington, we may pull out or something. But you are the experts. Oh, yeah. We have 3 presentations, and we'll go back to these and other issues. We want to stay with these issues for 2 or more 3 sessions if we can. So we look forward to your comments. Today you should all have a program, so I'm not going to be spending time introducing the speakers. They are all well known. We'll establish Marta Bengoa, Zadia, Feliciano, and Jesse Liss, who has just got his Ph.D. in sociology in this topic. And he's going to Mexico in September to study at UNAM, China's impact.
I would like to thank the Builder Center for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here, and I hope we can enjoy a very fruitful debate. So I'm going to talk about where we are heading with NAFTA. So first of all, there is no better moment to start talking about NAFTA, as you will very well said. Why? Because today the notification for the 90 days letter to start negotiations was delivered to the Congress, and starting probably in the middle of August, negotiations will start. 30 days before that day, the USTR has to present a plan, and taking from there, consult the Congress, and then the negotiations can start. So first of all, I would like to give you some of the facts, why it is NAFTA important, how important it is, what is the economic implications to be in a customs union with Canada and Mexico. Well, what is the main objective for a trade agreement? There are 3 main objectives for a trade agreement. First of all, it is market potential. Companies want to actually go into other markets and explore those possibilities. So that's the first objective of a free trade agreement. The second objective of a free trade agreement is to facilitate investment, usually, and liberalization of products. Liberalization with NAFTA happens at the end of 2008, when all tariffs were completely went down to 0, and final liberalization on agricultural products like corn and others was achieved. We have here, I have here a milestone of events. So even though it was signed 23 years ago, total liberalization, it happens really recently, which is in 2008. So it was a quite progressive liberalization, so both the three markets could adjust to changes in competition within different industries, which is what is achievable, a progressive liberalization process. All right. So how NAFTA has been affecting the US economy and the Mexican economy. Overall trade since NAFTA started has increased by 3 times. So it means that it started from $290 billion and now it achieved a worth value of $1.1 trillion. In terms of jobs, this means that 40 million jobs are in the US related directly and indirectly with NAFTA. Especially with Mexico, it is more than 5 million jobs. So I like to put pictures in my presentation. So if you see the US sales to Mexico are larger than all US exports to Brazil, Russia, China, Great Britain, France, Belgium, and Netherlands together. So that's how big it is, only with Mexico. So, and when it comes to jobs, this represents about 5 million US jobs that are dependent on trade with Mexico, right? When actually the president threatened to withdraw from NAFTA, there was a huge mobilization within the Congress and trying to convince the White House not to withdraw, to go for a more easier approach. If you have Twitter, for example, today, Vice President Pence has tweeted that they want an approach that will not harm, that will be beneficial for all trade partners. So even though the president has actually tried to put a hard stance on negotiations in NAFTA, the Vice President, Wilbur Ross, and the USTR are washing up all those approaches, all right? Why? Because if we see here, I mean, a lot of jobs in the United States depend on trade with Mexico and with Canada. To which point? So, to the point that I love this map, that you see what are the main exporters for every state.
Wow.
And what we are seeing here? What we are seeing is the validation of what we call the gravity model in trade. The gravity model in trade is telling us that the size of the market is very important and proximity is also very important. So you see the states in the south, their main trading partner is Mexico, while the states in the north, the main trading partner is Canada. And then some of them is dependent. I mean, for example, China, and there you have Brazil, which is goal-oriented. So, but our main trading partners, no question about, are 3, which are China, Canada, and Mexico. And when it comes to exports, it is Canada and Mexico. So here. So here are our main trading partners, as you see. So the darker green represents exports, and as you see, substantially, Canada is one of our largest markets, even higher, at a larger level than China, and then it is followed by Mexico. So withdrawing from NAFTA means that the 3 countries will go back to actually trade under what we call the WTO rules, which is the rules established by the World Trade Organization, which establishes tariffs in the most favored nation. It means that on average now there is no tariffs for most products. And then it will go back from 4-5%, but for some products it can go up to 100% in sugar, which means that all of us consumers will see those increases in tariff in the prices of those products, which is highly disruptive for consumer welfare. Not only for consumer welfare, also for producers' welfare. Producers use Canada, especially Mexico, to import. You see that imports are extremely important, from China especially, but also combined, they are equally important from Canada and Mexico. Why is that? Because our production is highly sophisticated. And that production in the US needs inputs. factors of production to actually produce the final output. And that final product needs intermediate inputs that actually are produced in Mexico and Canada. So the fact that these imports are cheaper help us to be more competitive with respect to Europe, for example, right? So the overall idea that imports are bad and focusing on the trade deficit is really, really misleading. To be competitive, you not only need to be selling a good that everybody likes, but you also need to control the cost of production. And a way to control the cost of production is by getting inputs from other nations that have comparative advantage in producing those inputs at a cheaper level. And then we import them and assemble them and sell it to other markets. So the overall idea, if you leave this room with the idea that trade deficits are actually not a bad thing, that our exports are important as well as imports, because our producers need those inputs to produce and be competitive with respect to other Western economies, I will be very happy with that. All right? So our president is really, really obsessed with the fact that we have trade deficits. And as he's using here, since 2001, the trade deficit has increased. Why? Because our companies, in a globalized world, where there is global value chains, everything is integrated. China is actually developing, so obviously they are also selling products that everybody likes. So how we can compete? By getting inputs that are actually cheaper than we can actually produce within here. To produce any intermediate good within the United States could be twice or three times higher cost, will support higher cost than produce it in Mexico. So we import those intermediate goods, we put them together, and then we export. And the trade deficit is the result of macroeconomic imbalances. In this country, the level of savings is very low, and the level of investment is large, because we have big or large producers and medium enterprises that are very, that they invest and they produce. So that gap in between savings and investment is what is driving up the deficit. The trade deficit is not the result of any trade policy, which is the result of macroeconomic imbalances, and in this economy, precisely, it is the difference in between the level of savings and the level of investment. We receive many capital flows from other countries, which actually increases the capital account and reduces the current account, which is the trade deficit. All right, so focusing on reducing the deficits when it comes to trade policy is the wrong approach. Because our producers need those, they really need those inputs to be able to be competitive. And if we put tariffs on those inputs, then how those producers within the US are going to be competitive compared to the one in Europe, or in New Zealand, or in Australia? Okay? So, imports, it is true, and we have to acknowledge as well, that the process, the integration also creates some disallocation problems, which is offshoring. So many of the companies, if they are precisely US companies that produce intermediate inputs, it will be better for them, instead of importing, producing in Mexico. So there has been disallocation of production activity, and this has actually led to job losses. So we have to acknowledge that. And approximately the job losses are in between 600K and 700,000 people when it comes to job losses. If we see that in a global labor market, that's not very significant. But if we see it in a micro approach, individually, is significant. All right? So, but to offset these loss, we gain in other sectors. A specialization in labor, export companies are highly productive. They pay a premium in between 50 and 20% wage, higher wage, and then we enjoy lower prices, all right? That otherwise will be totally passed through to consumers. All right, so what I think is going to happen with the negotiation? So what I think is going to happen with the negotiation, where are we heading? So today the letter was sent to the Congress, and Negotiations, as we said, will start probably at the end of August. So is there room for improvement? Yes, there is room for improvement. So NAFTA needs to be modernized and needs to be updated. What are the possibilities? Basically, we have three possibilities. No agreement. So if negotiations don't go well, fall back, then there will be no agreement, and we will be falling back to the World WTO rules, which an average tariff of in between 5%, but for some goods could be, as I said, 100%. So that's the worst scenario. We don't want this to happen. All right, so that's the worst scenario. It will be painful for the U.S. economy, for Mexican economy, and for from Canada as well. So all the efforts will be in trying to actually negotiate some changes and additions that will be putting the president at rest or addressing the main concerns. And what is desirable, it is what we call NAFTA 2.0, the new NAFTA. The new NAFTA, how we would like that new NAFTA to be negotiated and signed. Well, there are some provisions and chapters that need to be updated and some that need to be incorporated. What, in my opinion, are the most important? First of all, TPP could be served as a template. It was already agreed by Mexico, Canada, and the US, and 10 other nations in the Pacific. So that was already agreed. The negotiations were ongoing for many years, and it was already agreed. So TPP, in my opinion, and you will see at the end of the year, will be served as a template. And many of the provisions and chapters in TPP will be adopted. All right, what are the most important changes, in my opinion? Rules of origin. What is this of rule of origin? When to avoid trade diversion, so goods coming through one of the markets, for example, China, shipping goods to Mexico and then enter the US for free. To avoid that, we have in trade agreements one chapter that is called rules of origin. To enter the US, any product has to have at least manufacturing 62.5% content from the three countries. If those products don't have this local content, they cannot be NAFTA approach. They are not tariff-free. TPP has relaxed that to 45-50%. Why? Because global value chains are broad, and now they are integrated with Japan, with China. So they want to relax the content, but still, I mean, it's 50%. 50% of the content will have to be NAFTA proof. NAFTA proof, okay? To avoid trade diversion. Regulation right now in NAFTA with respect to rules of origin is extremely complex and cumbersome. It is many producers that are in Canada and Mexico don't use NAFTA tariffs because it's so complex to certify that 62% belongs to NAFTA, to the three countries, that they prefer to pay the tariff. Because of the cost of certification is larger, higher, greater than the cost of paying the tariff. So it means that actually the free trade agreement is in place, but it's not being used. So that's why TPP was concerned, I mean, the negotiations were concerned on that, about it, and they relaxed to 45%. But still, it's 45% bill in the three countries because it accumulates. Then another problem with many of the producers in the three countries have, it is transparency. Many times the custom laws are not enforced. Goods enter the country at a lower level, at a lower price than the cost, and then it goes with anti-dumping rules, the application of anti-dumping rules, and it really harms competition. All right, so if the government in any of these countries subsidize one particular production and enters the country at a lower cost, obviously the local producers are going to be harmed. So custom laws and the enforcement of these custom laws are extremely important to actually avoid the diversification in trade. All right, so that's something. How do you enforce that? More digitalization, more training, etc. Also, another issue in NAFTA is the bottleneck, shorten up the timing. The time that the merchandise or all the products stay in ports. Sometimes the delivery can stay 20 days in the port, and it's it's retail. So customers want their whatever they have bought online, they want it in 1 week. But sometimes many producers, they cannot deliver because whatever they have been importing from Mexico or Canada stay in ports for longer, right? So that's one aspect the modern updating of NAFTA will bring. E-commerce, which is extremely important. That obviously 23 years ago it didn't happen, but everything is online now. All right, so that's one of the main issues to focus. Making sure that software, music, video don't pay duties. And it's very important to focus on the localization. Right now, our localization rules make all the companies need to establish different servers in all the affiliates. It doesn't make sense. They have to have the main server in the headquarters, and the rest has to be data flow. But there has to be protections. Another way of improving NAFTA is focusing on labor and environmental standards. Environmental standards is the use of chemicals, the use of hormones, antibiotics in meat and chicken. There was a huge dispute in between Europe and the US because here we have some techniques that we wash chickens in chlorine, so that's not acceptable for Europe. So to update those environmental rules will be actually benefiting consumers and also producers, and it will be a convergence in the standards. And when it comes to labor requirements, my take is that probably US is going to be asking Mexico to try progressively to increase the minimum wage, so wages converge. And there is no such a large difference in between wages in Mexico and wages here, so the offshoring makes less sense. Because remember, the focus is to bring back jobs, to avoid FDI, and to actually avoid trade diversion, okay? Unfair competition. And finally, another, what we could see some changes is in public procurement. So public procurement will probably impose American-made or NAFTA-made. So if there is going to be any road or any pipe, so the steel that is used has to be produced within the NAFTA countries. All right. So these are the main points that will be desirable to update. Those negotiations will take a lot of time. If we want to change all these chapters and provisions, this doesn't happen in 1 round or 2 rounds of negotiations. It will take a lot of time. Is that we are going to see decaffeinated NAFTA by the end of the year that will approach some of the concerns that we have tackled over here, but not all of them. For that, we need a longer term. Okay? Well, let's see.
Gracias, Marta.
De nada.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Zadia Feliciano. I'm a professor at Queens College and here at the Graduate Center. And I'd like to thank Mauricio Font for the invitation to present today, and to the Bildner Center. It's my first time presenting, and it's a pleasure to be here. And also, thank you to my co-panelists, because I see, each one of us is slightly different and brings an interesting view to NAFTA. So I'm going to talk about renegotiating NAFTA from the standpoint of the goal of renegotiating NAFTA according to the administration. Okay. Before Trump appeared in the political arena, no one talked about renegotiating NAFTA. Nope. So I think it's important to understand what is the goal of renegotiation according to the administration, and whether we can achieve those goals, And like Marta was saying, there's other issues that definitely need to be tackled. And in that sense, all of the countries would benefit from renegotiations. Okay, so here I wanted to say that there is a reason why the Trump administration wants to renegotiate on Nafta, and in particular, it is that the administration is claiming that Nafta cost 700,000 American jobs, damaged American manufacturing, and increased the trade deficit. And therefore, we have to renegotiate to make this agreement better for our workers. So that's kind of the premise. But to understand this position, you have to also understand what has been happening in the U.S. economy and to U.S. workers. So we have two things that matter: the aftermath of the financial crisis and the stagnation of real wages over 5 decades. So here is, apparently we're in the best of times. Household wealth is an all-time high. But we're also at the worst of time because we've had a very slow economic growth, especially after the financial crisis. We are also at the worst of times because the participation rate of the population has dropped dramatically over the last 20 to 30 years. And this is especially true for low-skill males who have dropped their participation rates dramatically. Okay, so what about hourly wages? Hourly wages have actually grown very little, stagnated since 1975. So this is hourly compensation, whereas this is productivity of workers. This is the compensation, and compensation is kind of flat. So in the old days, you know, our children were doing better than us, and now our children are not necessarily doing better. Okay, and of course the younger generations get affected by it more. Okay, so NAFTA and globalization explain some of the developments, some of the stagnation in economic growth. So, you know, here we have President Trump wishes to renegotiate NAFTA to bring back jobs to America, which it's a great cost, but I'm not sure the renegotiating of NAFTA is going to bring back those jobs that we all want to bring back, not just the administration, right? Good paying jobs. So it's a lot more complicated than that. So, you know, Marta already went through the main things about NAFTA, the fact that it was signed in 1994 and tariffs were eliminated within 15 years. That was 2008? Yeah, 2008. So, you know, I have some notes about what happened that year. That was a terrible year for Mexico. They had the Zapatista rebellion, they had the peso crisis during that year, and the presidential candidate, Luis Donaldo Colosio, passed away. Okay, so this shows you the change in the tariffs. A tariff is a tax on imports, and with NAFTA, Mexico, Canada, and the U.S. are supposed to go to have trade without tariffs, without taxes on imports. So here's what we call the MFN tariff. And the MFN tariff is basically most favored nation tariff is negotiated for all countries that belong to the WTO. But this is the Nafta tariff, the one that is actually going to zero. So the one not in the red, the black one. As you could see, from 1990 to 2000, the tariffs went to zero. Okay, what has been the impact of Nafta? Apparently, according to the CBO, there's been a lot of growth in trade, and this is U.S. real export growth since Nafta to Canada, to Mexico, and to the rest of the world. And this is just showing you that, in fact, Nafta has made us trade more with Canada and Mexico and less with the rest of the world, although a lot more with Mexico. Okay, so it solidifies our trade relationship. And as Marta said, Mexico is one of our largest trading partners, Canada and Mexico, and of course, China. Okay, so Marta was talking about trade deficits. One of the claims about why is NAFTA so bad? NAFTA is bad maybe because we have a trade deficit with Mexico. And this shows, basically, this is both with NAFTA, with Canada and Mexico, and it shows, yes, this is the trade, the blue shows you the imports, the gray shows you the exports. So we have more imports from NAFTA countries than we have exports, and therefore we have a trade deficit. That is, imports are greater than exports. Okay, but one of the things that we trade from Mexico is oil. So, that should not be in the statistics because it's really not part of what NAFTA is all about. So take out oil and we're kind of close to trade balance. So the trade deficit is much smaller. Okay, so this is showing the same bilateral trade. Mexico's exports are in the light blue. The light green, and the exports are in darker green. So what do we import and export from Mexico and from our NAFTA partners? Well, basically we import crude oil, which is not part of NAFTA, but the second largest thing we import is motor vehicles. So just to give you an idea, motor vehicles are the biggest part of the NAFTA agreement, because they are the ones that benefit the most from the agreement. And we also see that our biggest export to Mexico is motor vehicles parts. Because the way it works is that Canada and the US produce the parts of the vehicles, the cars, and then we export them to Mexico. And then they get assembled there. They're assembled there because it's cheaper. And assembly is the lowest part of the manufacturing chain. So this is called vertical integration, where you do some things in Mexico, do some things in the U.S., some things in Canada, and some things in Mexico. But the cheapest part of the production process is assembly, and that's what they do. So they're not really taking the high-end jobs within the auto industry. This just shows you vehicles are by far the largest amounts of import we get from vehicles when you take out oil and electric machinery. So one thing that you should note now is that the trade statistics do not reflect value added. So what happens is that we made parts of a good, right? Parts of the vehicles. We export them to Mexico. Mexico puts together the car, right? And then we import the car back. So the statistics don't really tell you how much of that, the value of that car, is actually made in Mexico. If the assembly was made just in Mexico, the R&D, the research and development was done in the US, the parts were made here or in Canada. So a big chunk of the value added of that vehicle that we import from Mexico, it's actually made in the US. All right, and the statistics completely missed that, and we trade economists know that. In 2011, the foreign content share of their export was 32%. About a third of what Mexico is exporting to us was not made in Mexico. The value added of those goods is only 70%, right? And everything else was made somewhere else.
70% is not small.
No, not small, but that doesn't mean that's correct. That doesn't mean that you still have the trade statistics with the car industry, which is the biggest part of the Nafta agreement, right? 30% is still a big chunk, right? And when you do the trade statistics, and I can't claim I've done it, but it might just balance your trade because those are not in there. It's the same thing with the iPhone. We import the iPhone, but only a smaller part, a very small part of the production is done in China. You ask people, where is the iPhone made in China? Wrong. Right, so these cars are partly made in Mexico. That's what I wanted to say. Okay, so how big is the effect of NAFTA in the US? So this is in terms of Canada. Canada's exports and imports from the US is pretty high, okay? It's about almost all their trade. Okay, so we're the largest trading partner for them, okay? And for the US, well, that's less than 25%. So that tells you that NAFTA is huge for Canada. This is also true for Mexico. Even though Mexico is a large trading partner for us, NAFTA, imports and exports of NAFTA are only a small part of our trade, less than 25%, but they are about 75%, roughly speaking, at and take 70%, something like that. It could be, some of it is, the imports is like 50%, where the exports is more than 75. Okay, so the impact of NAFTA on jobs. Job losses to NAFTA have been estimated to 100,000 manufacturing net job losses. That's equivalent to 0.1% of the US labor force. Okay, that's small, very, very small. Moreover, I want to point out the decline in manufacturing has nothing to do with NAFTA. If you look at the manufacturing sector, they shed 2.7 million jobs between 1979 and 1993, that's before NAFTA, and 2.9 million jobs between 1993 and 2007. So we were already losing manufacturing jobs. And NAFTA is not the reason for that. It could be part of the reason, but definitely is not the only reason. Okay, and then I want to show you changes in wages for full-time workers. And here we have the bottom, you see the red line, those are high school wages of high school graduates, and the yellow is wages of college graduates, and you can see the gap between the college graduates and the high school graduates starts to increase in the 70s and keeps increasing and continues to increase. This is why we are renegotiating NAFTA. These people are not doing well. The people with high school degrees are not doing well. They've had it really rough. They're saying, we have a political, we speak, we vote, take care of us. And so I think that's one of the reasons for Trump being where he is, and for renegotiating NAFTA. Now, that's a lot more complicated than that. According to McLaren, even though it's hard to see the impact of NAFTA when you have the whole U.S., because as Marta was explaining, only certain areas are very affected by NAFTA. The rest of the country doesn't as much. So when you look at those areas most affected by NAFTA, the states closer to Mexico, we see that NAFTA is associated with a decrease in wage growth for blue-collar workers and most affected industries and localities. So and this is more recent work by McLaren and Jacobian, and I think that shows you the pain that low-skilled workers have had. Now, labor economists say, okay, there are various reasons for the decline in wages of the low-skilled workers. One is trade. And according to trade economists, trade theory says that the factor used intensively in the export sectors will experience a real increase in returns, but the factor used intensively in the importing sector should actually experience a real decrease in returns. That means if we export high skill intensive goods and services, and we import low skill intensive goods and services, then the real wages of the high skill are going to go up and the real wages of low skill are going to go down. So the statistics are consistent with that story. But the statistics are also consistent with something labor economists have been worried about, and is technological change. Technological change in terms of computers and in terms of robots, for example, in manufacturing. More recent work of labor economists have shown whenever there's a robot that shows up in a plant, about 6 jobs are lost. Automation, we had a different kind of automation when we started to mechanize, right? But now there's a new revolution because of computers and robots, and there's nothing stopping that, and no matter how much we renegotiate NAFTA, this is not going to go away. Now, immigration of low-skilled workers is also a possible factor in the decline or stagnation of real wages of low-skilled workers, and that's because most of our immigrants are low-skilled. And that's why, in certain communities, there is this tension, for those of us who are high-skilled, we're not in the same market competing for jobs, but the low-skilled workers are. Okay, so I'm just repeating what Mauricio said about renegotiations of NAFTA. It's happening today. The president formally launched an effort to renegotiate, and we have 90 days to consult with Congress, Mrs. and American public, and the renegotiations will start on August 16th. According to the U.S. Trade Representative, Robert Lichthizer, NAFTA has been good for U.S. agriculture, investment services, and energy, but not for manufacturing. I beg to differ. Areas for negotiations include, as Marta talked about, digital trade. When we did the negotiations in 1994, there was no digital trade, right? There were no internets. So that's one. The second one is the intellectual property rights, because Mexico is a violator of a lot of the intellectual property rights. Labor and environmental standards that Marta talked about, rules of state-owned enterprises, because some of these firms are owned by the state of Mexico and food safety standards. So, okay. So is this good, bad? I labeled this as the ugly. It's very hard to renegotiate once you start renegotiating because there's 3 countries with different interests. And I don't, as Marta said, this is going to take a long time. But are there going to be? I said Mexico is actually right now really wants to get this over with. The reason is it's already affecting them. In 2016, FDI in Mexico decreased by 6%. And in 2017, FDI, foreign direct investment, is expected to decline by 21%. People are frozen because they don't want to invest in Mexico because they don't know what's going to happen to Nafta. So foreigners don't want to do that. And gains for American workers, not clear we can bring back high-paying manufacturing jobs, unfortunately. And if negotiations make it harder for firms to assemble cars in Mexico, perhaps robots will be given these jobs. Assembly cars is not in the U.S. comparative advantage. Thank you.
The last presentation again, we are getting a lot of facts and numbers on the new Nafta debate, which is going to be accelerating in the next few weeks. And we'll be seeing a lot of that stuff going on and from an impact on Mexico and other places. So a lot of questions, I'm sure I have them, you have them, let's wait a bit.
Yeah, so I just finished my dissertation, so this is my first talk. And so thank you very much, Professor Font and the Builder Center for having me and for having us and sharing and discussing. But I think these to be important issues. And I just want to reiterate what Zadia said, why we're here, right? We're here because we just had an election and our now president made trade center to his platform, and he took these positions, right, pretending to be this tough guy on trade, right, calling NAFTA disaster. You want to label China a currency manipulator, which he immediately did a 180 on. On the TPP, he said, and excuse my language, but I need to quote the president, he said it's a rape of the country by special interests, right? You have to apologize when you quote Trump. So that's arguably a reason that he got into office, a big reason he got into office, and that's why we're here today, right as these NAFTA negotiations happen. I just want to make the argument that I'm going to make in the next 5-10 minutes, small argument, is that he's breaking his trade promises on NAFTA, right, because he was threatening to withdraw NAFTA and he called it a disaster, and he's breaking his trade promises. The reason, as he learns reality, is that the argument that I'm going to make is because China, since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, they became North America's second largest trading partner. That is, they became essentially the fourth partner in the NAFTA. And so the reality of NAFTA is that he's learning that in order to sustain North American industries, you need to have a game plan with a new competitor in East Asia. So when we talk about the China challenge, we're talking about really East Asia, as Zadia had said. That is, China is a final assembly point in East Asia manufacturing, that in East Asia supply chains, particularly in electronics and semiconductors. So that's what we mean by China challenge. So as China, the rise of China, if you take a long view of history, the re-emergence of China as a world superpower, the challenge of it is that as China exports to North America, and I'm using North America and NAFTA as interchangeable terms, they displaced intra-NAFTA trade, right? Chinese imports had displaced intra-NAFTA imports, in particularly in 3 key sectors, in electronics, textiles, and we're beginning to see it in automobiles. And these are the most dynamic and important sectors for the region. So this is from a New York Times article a few years ago, a quote. This is a conversation when Obama wanted to bring back manufacturing jobs, right? Trump wasn't the first one with this idea. He went to meet with Silicon Valley, and so as Steve Jobs spoke, Obama interrupted and said, "How can we make iPhones in the U.S.?" And so Steve Jobs said, "Those jobs aren't coming back." Right. So that's what we mean. So a little bit of the story of the NAFTA. NAFTA was originally designed, as Professor Font said before my time, NAFTA was designed to facilitate regional economies of scale for regional firms. And regional firms, most multinational corporations actually operate on a regional basis. If you look at their assets and their sales, they're mostly done on a regional basis and not a global basis. And so the NAFTA was designed to facilitate regional economies of scale for U.S. firms in manufacturing, services, particularly financial services, and mining and energy. So I'm just going to talk about manufacturing. And this is, you see the manufacturing FDI is leading. This is U.S. FDI to foreign direct investment to Mexico. Manufacturing leads the way. So in 1992, as the U.S. is negotiating the NAFTA, here this is the main private sector advisory committee to the United States Trade Representative, and they say, well, our idea here is that we want to be able to facilitate investments into Mexico so that we can use Mexico as a low-cost export platform to the rest of the world, not just North America, but to the rest of the world, so that the U.S. and Mexico actually exports, they co-produce together, right? This isn't U.S. versus Mexico, Mexico versus U.S. When we're talking about who are the actors involved in trade, these are international firms that are concerned about a global market share, right? Not what is the national interest. They could care less about the national interest. So we're talking about three. I just want to talk about three sectors: the automobile sector, electronics, and textile. And so when they sat down to make the NAFTA, the USTR, Mexico, Canada, in terms of manufacturing, these three sectors were important because they were facing import competition from East Asia, or you could see it coming. And so the NAFTA they designed the NAFTA to facilitate these industries and using Mexico as a low-cost export platform in these three industries. And the reason is that Mexican imports to the U.S. contain a very high content of U.S.-made goods, whereas imports from East Asia contain a very low U.S. content. So basically, the numbers are, before the NAFTA, Mexican goods contained 5% U.S. content, roughly. 20 years later, one estimate says 40%, right? So this is a success of the NAFTA, right? That U.S. maintains manufacturing plants because of the NAFTA by co-producing with Mexico. Whereas imports from China are estimated to have only 4%, right? And so this strategy of co-producing with Mexico was relatively successful until 2001. You had GDP, employment, productivity all growing in all three countries until China joins the WTO in 2001. And so this is a chart. It shows the share of the world's total exports. And the top line is NAFTA's exports, and the bottom line is China and East Asia's exports, share of world exports. And you see 2001 is an inflection point. That is, China joins the WTO in 2001. And immediately after, NAFTA's share of world export markets declines, and East Asia's rapidly increases. And in 2006 is when East Asia has a larger share of the world's export markets. And so I want to briefly review three studies from three economists who've done work on this issue. Dr. Enrique Dussel-Peters, Samuel Ortiz Velasquez in Illinois, and Peter Gallagher in Boston. They've made a few studies about this. This is one of their charts. They're showing a share of U.S. imports, and what this shows is China gaining market share while Mexico and Canada are declining in market share. So since 2001, in terms of all of North American trade, intra-regional trade is declining. So the three people that I just cited, one study they did, which is very interesting, they looked at 52 sectors in manufacturing, and they were looking at, is there a threat from China in terms of what North America produces? And a threat means that one country is gaining while at the expense of another country, right? And so they found that in all 52 sectors, China is a threat to North American production. That is, in Mexico, Chinese imports are displacing U.S. imports, and in the U.S., Chinese imports are displacing Mexican exports. And in the U.S., in terms of Mexican imports in the U.S., that's 49% of all of Mexico's exports to the U.S. Right, so Mexico had a lot to lose. And one of the kickers is that NAFTA's exports in mid to high technology products have been falling in relative terms while China's have been rising, which has negative consequences to local supply chains in Mexico as they lose business to Chinese imports. This is a small chart that shows U.S. manufacturing affiliates in Mexico, Canada, and China, and this just shows that employment in those affiliates, since when China joins in 2001, U.S. employment in manufacturing affiliates declines while China's increases. And just briefly, I want to talk about these three supply chains. Okay, 2 minutes. Okay, information technology. After the NAFTA, all the global flagships moved to Guadalajara. They established manufacturing plants. The dot-com bubble burst. They all moved to China. And textile and apparel. Here in 1990, Mexico had about 3% of U.S. imports in textiles and apparel. I think my shirt is made in Bangladesh. I really like this. Not from Mexico. In 2000, they were able to increase it to 14%. But then by 2010, they lose half their market share while China's increases rapidly. We're talking about U.S. market share. And in the auto industry has been relatively well protected because, as my interlocutor said, rules of origin, which are rules that require a certain amount of regional content. But we're beginning to see China penetrate the auto industry, the North American auto industry. But importantly, the auto industry is key because when the big three, GM, Chrysler, when they invest in Mexico, Ford, thank you. When they invest in Mexico, they're able to use Mexico as a low-cost export platform so that they can amortize their investments in high-technology manufacturing in the U.S., right? So that basically the entire auto industry is dependent upon Mexico. In 2005, Chinese auto parts were 3.2% of Mexico's imported auto parts. Now it's nearly 10%. China is the largest auto producer in the world. They will soon exhaust their domestic market and they will be looking to export. So in the campaign trail, Trump says, okay, NAFTA is a disaster, right? These multinational corporations are un-American. But as they're quickly doing a reverse course, right? The USTR's draft notice to Congress proposes no substantive changes to the NAFTA. Peter Navarro, Trump's trade guy, wants stricter rules of origin, which is the complete opposite of what Trump promised. So in conclusion, I just want to make 2 points. First of all, whatever you want to call Trump's trade policy, North America first, United States multinational corporations first, whatever you want to call it, it's not America first. So the first point I want to make is that he's breaking his trade promises to his voting population. And the second point I want to make is that Obama had a plan moving forward. His plan was the TPP. Right now, Trump withdrew from the TPP and he's back to square one. And NAFTA is an already outdated model trade strategy for stimulating regional growth. And that's, so thank you.
We had a lot of views on NAFTA and the new NAFTA debate. The last set of points are also very exciting, as were the first two set presentations on the role of China. Questions? And yes, Joe.
Well, all three presentations are incredibly interesting, and I learned a lot, but I have a particular question about China, on the TPP, because we know very little about the TPP, and since it was obviously not implemented, Bernie Sanders also, of course, is very strong against TPP. How would TPP implemented, how would it affect the NAFTA relationship and our economy? How would it limit the Chinese invasion of NAFTA, so to speak?
Anybody?
China was not in the TPP. One of the reasons for the TPP was exactly that.
Exactly.
To
You're using microphone. It's very strange.
sorry, can you? Oh, so China was not in the TPP. Other Asian countries were. Even Japan was in it at the end. And the reason for the TPP was really to become more competitive and not to allow China to, grab more of the trade pie, basically. Because a lot of the countries involved, Vietnam, for example, to take an example, or Thailand, but Vietnam, they're very low cost. Vietnam is even lower cost than China. So we could take advantage of that and produce, goods vertically, meaning we make some of it and then send it to Asia, and it's built, completely assembled there, and then we are probably more competitive compared to China.
Larry. Larry than you.
Okay, in terms of NAFTA, I grew up in Santa Ana, California, in Orange County, which is the second most Mexican city, so I followed this very closely during the 90s. And the reality was the left in the United States and the labor unions opposed NAFTA. And the only reason it passed was obviously President Clinton's support made a big difference. Right. But it was the Republicans and Democrats in Texas, California, New Mexico, and Arizona who broke ranks with the Democrats in the rest of the country that provided the majority for NAFTA to pass. So that to me is an important dimension. Now, we were interviewing a faculty person who had graduated from school in California, and he was a little concerned because he was interviewing, and the left-wing people at my university was asking him about NAFTA. And he was in a delicate situation because the left in this country had opposed it. And he simply said, if not this NAFTA now, 1993, what NAFTA when? So NAFTA came about because Texas, New Mexico, Arizona, and California felt on so many different levels that there was a linkage between those states and Mexico, and we needed to form a closer partnership. So when we go now to 2017, who's going to defend NAFTA and who's going to oppose it? We can see a political realignment on it, which hasn't yet played out. Now, you had mentioned corn, and I was in dialogue with the elite of Mexico during NAFTA, and one of the issues was the possible impact of NAFTA on Mexican peasant farmers, particularly in corn because of the tortillas. And the elite said that for Mexico to be a modern country, they had to reduce the number of people in agriculture, and NAFTA was the vehicle to force Mexican peasants off the farm and into other activities. So when you look at NAFTA 2017, the key data point is there is roughly no trade deficit between the United States and Mexico, that's balanced. When you pull out automobiles, there is balanced trade between Mexico and US. The big trade deficit, $60 billion, is in automobiles. And the question to me becomes, in this renegotiations, is whether or not the Trump administration is going to say cars sold in America should be made in America, and that this is going to be the big issue. What is going to happen in automobiles? So I just asked the three of you, what is your take on the status of the relationship between future relationship between Mexico and the United States on automobiles?
Larry, by the way, a question, your question. In 1993-94, when NAFTA was voted in the Congress, the East, the Northeast, and New York, which way did they go?
Oh, they were all anti-NAFTA.
You sure?
The Northeast Democrats were totally anti-NAFTA. The labor unions were totally NAFTA.
I remember that.
So the Republicans who were in the Northeast voted for it. So it was a coalition, because the Congress was controlled by the Democrats. It was a coalition between Republicans and Southwest Democrats in those four border states. Otherwise, it wouldn't have passed.
Well, but at the end, it actually enjoys bipartisan support, so that's why it passed.
It depends how you define bipartisan.
Well, in the Senate and the Congress, so actually passed because they vote for it. And I know, yeah, that's the definition of
The
bipartisan.
Democrats opposed it.
Not everybody.
A majority of
It
the
passed.
Democrats opposed it.
But it's, I mean, if we think about who benefits the most are actually the supporters, which are the South states. But answering your question,
Southwestern.
yeah, Southwestern. So answering your question, yeah, in my presentation, I think I addressed part of your question. One of the main issues is going to be to negotiate the rules of origin, which is what is the regional content in vehicles. If we take a hard standpoint, they are going to go for 65%. So 65% local content, cumulative in between the three countries. But the way it is right now, the world is organized. It doesn't make sense to have such a high content. It could disrupt greatly the global value chains and all the intermediate components that are coming from Japan and China when it comes to build automobiles. So a more less conservative approach is to go for in between 40 and 50%, which is what they already agreed, the negotiators, in TPP. I don't know where it's going to go. My take is it's going to be obviously in between 40 and 65%. If Trump wants a hard stance, then they will stay with 65 the way it is right now, which is pretty high compared to other countries.
Alan,
Yeah, I want to do a comparison of how an incoming president who comes in on an economic wave of that's what I'm going to be dealing with, reacts with the politics and with the expert advice. The best example is FDR, 1933. He sends the economist Warburg, senator from the Silver State, Nevada, to the conference, comes back with advice. Number one, stay on gold. Number two, loosen the flow. What does he do? He ignores it because politically, he doesn't want to be seen taking advice from bankers, number one. And number two, he's afraid of inflation, which the experts knew that wasn't going to be the problem. Now, he was an insider. I mean, he was a Wall Street lawyer. So maybe he thinks that he has a better handle on it. Now, I don't know Trump. Trump, again, politically, he's going to make a decision, I'm almost sure of it, that may go against what expert advice of economists are. I'm curious, he's a deal maker, he's a businessman, but does he himself feel like he's an expert at the economics, the way economics work? My feeling is he probably isn't, and he will go along, in his case, against the political wisdom of, hey, let's get rid of NAFTA and go that way, but it might go the other way. I mean, I think the politics will be in
The uncertainty, I agree, is very high. We don't know where the flow is going to go, but I mean, I do believe we have very good civil servants. The USTR, which is the Trade Department in the US, is one of the best in the world. Tie up, I mean, with the European Commission Trade Department. So, and they have been in many negotiations. We have more than 20 trade agreements with the rest of the world. They've been negotiating little by little, but surely. We are a trade, in terms of trade, we are an immense market, and it's in our interest to negotiate well. So they will have to try to convince him how that trade agreement will be serving its constituencies. The last thing was heard, it is that actually they were trying to overlap the number of people affected by Nafta with their voters. And when he saw that, he said, okay, maybe I'm not withdrawing from Nafta, because I mean, some of his Rust Belt voters are going to be affected by the trade agreement. So it's actually, you don't want to shoot yourself in the foot before delivering. So we have very good civil servants. USTR is one of the best trade departments in the world. They know what they are doing. And if you have been observing the flow of comments to the press, etc., it's already heading in the right direction. Yesterday, they were said, our objective is to negotiate, to try to get the best agreement with no harms, which is a very good stance. Because when you sit on a table to negotiate, you don't want to upset your partners. Mexico and Canada have been really, really diplomatic, and they say, we are ready, whenever you are ready, we are ready to negotiate. So right now, I have hope that the negotiations are going to be quite well, but not that the negotiation is going to change NAFTA upside down.
Another round of questions, yes.
I was wondering that's
Just speak loud, his room is a little awkward,
I
acoustic.
was wondering that's with every trades it has to be bilateral, both have to be benefit. I'd like to hear more from the Mexican side. You know, it's been almost 20 years. What kind of impact does this NAFTA on the economy of the Mexican people?
Well, I don't agree with your statement.
I'd like to hear more from
That I don't agree with the statement that it has to be bilateral. Now all the free trade agreements should be multilateral, but the approach of the administration is to be bilateral. In Mexico has created a polarization process in which the north of Mexico is the rich part of Mexico, in which the manufacturing of vehicles is located. So it has been a huge disallocation and polarization in terms of high-skilled workers within Mexico, located in the north, and low-skilled workers, Mexican workers, actually located in the south, which they don't see the effects of NAFTA themselves. And also a big gap in wages. So the people living in the north, close to the border, the US border, they enjoy up to 20% higher salaries than people living in the south of Mexico. So that's one of the effects of globalization and trades. It creates some divergences, which has to be addressed with distributional policies, which sometimes they don't work very well.
I just want to add that from the standpoint of Mexico, they've grown a lot. You know, that NAFTA has helped them a lot, but for example, agriculture, it's not, trade doesn't help everyone. It's always, there are some who gain and some who lose, and I think that's what Marta was saying and the gentleman here was saying. So people who agriculture, especially focused on corn, they got devastated by NAFTA. But you know, manufacturing benefited. However, I have to add that Mexico's feeling about NAFTA is also that they don't want just to do the assembly, that they expected more of NAFTA. They don't want to just do the low end of the manufacturing process. So they saw NAFTA as a way to transfer some of the technology and do some of the heavy lifting in manufacturing, which I think is proven not to be the case.
Yes, do you want to weigh in?
There's a number of questions. How would TPP have affected North American markets? There's historically people that make future predictions about what these trade agreements are going to do have all been very wrong. They predicted all kinds of very high growth predictions that the NAFTA completely failed predictions. So it's very difficult to say what it would have done. But politically, what it would have done was create more globalization. So by withdrawing from the TPP, Trump did a big blow to these processes of globalization. The labor union opposition to NAFTA, absolutely. Labor unions, environmental groups, consumer advocacy groups, human rights groups, all oppose NAFTA. Opposition to NAFTA was bipartisan. Support for NAFTA was bipartisan. Trade is just kind of a funny policy area like that. Probably the only one like that. And I think the opposition from the leftism not the left, because Trump was tapping into these sentiments also. NAFTA contributed, like globalization, contributed to these job polarization trends in the US. Yes, these job numbers of net job losses are very small. It's like a drop in the bucket. But in terms of job polarization, which has contributed to job polarization. Job polarization means that you're getting a loss of middle-skilled income, middle-skilled jobs. It's contributing to these processes of job polarization, and I think in a way that's not particularly appreciated, but Trump understands that, and that's why, talking about the auto rules of origin, he owes a favor to voters in Ohio and Michigan, so I think you would expect higher rules of origin in auto. And in terms of the impact on Mexico, what the studies that I've seen are showing a polarized Mexico, meaning the Mexico that's connected to the global economy has productivity growth rates. Part of the informal sectors of the economy that are not connected to the global economy has declining productivity growth. So you have a tale of two Mexicos.
Thank you. We're very interested in your question, Mexico. And we have invited, and we're expecting replies. We have invited Mexican intellectuals, top ones, to come to New York and be part of our forum to address the question you're raising. So we may have some announcement at some point in the near future. Yeah, I could go on, but we already have other presentations on the topic. Yes.
Thank you. So one of the biggest criticisms of the TPP was that it would benefit multinational corporations, especially pharmaceutical companies, by production rights and intellectual property rights as well, therefore allowing them to raise their prices, and obviously this wouldn't benefit consumers. What aspects of this TPP platform in relation to intellectual property rights do you think would be drafted in the new NAFTA?
Do you want to give that, Zadia?
So you're asking whether it's good. I believe that pharmaceuticals is a very special case in the sense that I believe that in order to sell a drug somewhere, you have to be approved, and so our production of drugs here, we produce them, and we have to produce in the U.S. in order to for them to be sold because you have to go back to trials. So that's why you don't see a huge penetration of a lot of companies. Plus, it's not a competitive environment because of economies of scale, meaning you have to invest a lot of money in order to be a pharmaceutical. So do I think that, I'm not familiar with how important they were in TPP, but pharmaceuticals are not a big part of the North American Free Trade Agreement. They basically, you saw what it was. It's mostly cars and the electronics, right? That's, yeah.
So it works.
Yes.
But two things. The world is a free rider on R&D in pharmaceutical products here. So it requires tons of money, billions of dollars, for any drug to get into the market. And the wall is free riding on our research. So pharmaceutical companies need to put that markup on the drugs. What Nafta will do is to enforce some of the property rights. How it's going to affect the pharmaceutical industry, I do believe that it's going to be something more political. If they are savvy enough to lobby well in Whitehill, then you will see something right there, but not by the end of the year. I mean, all the things that we are talking about are extremely important and relevant. They were part of the TPP, but if we have a look at the timing, and it is in 3 months. In 3 months, you can lobby, negotiate, align your representatives to lobby for including provisions or some new chapters. So pharmaceuticals were a big part of the negotiation. Why? Because you have some countries as Peru and Chile, and you have Vietnam, where they may use generics. And in the US, the idea is, okay, we don't want generics. We are paying to discover those drugs. So the R&D that goes into the discovery and approval and trials, etc., it is huge. How we are going to make up for that investment? So there is a huge trade-off in the pharmaceutical industry. So from the point of view of consumers, I understand that for us it's better to use generics, but somebody has to discover the new drug or the new vaccine for malaria or anything. But those require huge investments, many years, and 90% of the trials fail. So there is, I mean, in TPP, we have many countries with many different alignments. So you have some developing countries and some very mature countries. Those that are developing they prefer generics. And us, that is very mature and actually the leader in pharmaceutical research, we want to be able to enforce the property rights because the pharmaceutical industries pay for it. So,
Okay, we have what you wanted to do.
So it's a very difficult,
Very brief,
to get the balance right.
very fast.
Very fast. I would expect whatever is in the TPP to be in the Nafta, and the intellectual property chapter is central to any U.S. free trade agreement. And your concern is about patent monopoly on life-saving medicines, which is not an economic question; it's a political question about the access to medicine.
But it is also an economic question because if the pharmaceuticals don't have any incentive to discover any drug, it's never discovered. And to have that incentive, they need to charge a price.
Right.
And you have to realize that the other big market is Europe. And in Europe, all market prices in drugs are actually negotiated by the states. The states monopolize the purchases of those drugs.
Yeah, I don't think they're mutually exclusive. I think they're very.
So to achieve the balance economically makes sense to actually protect the intellectual the property rights over those monopolies, or actually to allow those firms to exhaust the period 10 years, 20 years of the discovery, because you need to give the pharmaceuticals incentives to innovate, but also I understand the consumer side, which is very difficult to actually achieve the right balance.
We have time for a couple of more questions, yes.
Okay, so a couple of times actually corn was mentioned, and I think in free trade agreements around the world, agriculture is a pretty difficult thing to negotiate. And in Nafta, it's actually the only part that was just 3 bilateral agreements. It wasn't a multilateral agreement as in all the other aspects. And I was just wondering, in whatever the next step of Nafta is going to be, is it going to continue in terms of the agricultural part to be just bilateral agreements, or is there going to be some kind of multilateral solution?
I don't expect many changes in agriculture because actually the view is it is working well. So they don't want to disrupt that process. So the idea is minimal changes in agriculture. So the minimal changes. But the corn issue is still itching, so they will have to, but it will be a bilateral approach to that. But I don't expect to see any big changes on agriculture in Nafta.
Corn.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just have a question about how these traders are being sold, because I heard a commentator when he was comparing how TVP was being sold compared to Nafta. When you talk about Nafta, that it wasn't just the government that was just doing the work. You have people from industry, selling the benefits. You have people from the private sector, selling, Nafta compared to TVP, where you only have pretty much the government who was pushing for it. And also, secondly, there's another issue where Canada, which is pro-free trade, that people have a debate about it, but you didn't. And the guy who was writing a book about it was talking to Council on Foreign Relations that we didn't have this kind of debate in the U.S. where to create a consensus where free trade is good. And that we don't talk enough about the problems of automation and the geopolitical consequences, as well as you point out with having the current rule-based system that two people have offered. So I just want to know the panelist's thoughts about selling these trade deals.
Anybody?
You.
Jesse.
Yeah, the elephant in the room is about automation, right? We had a debate in CUNY last week, or what's the role of trade versus automation. The Obama administration took a very clear stance on that. They said people who oppose our free trade agreements are pouring their concerns in barking up the wrong tree, right? You should be worried about the machines and not trade agreements. I happen to disagree. I think if you look at, for example, the auto industry, if auto companies are investing in Mexico and using Mexico as a low-cost export platform, which then allows them to make investments in technology, that means that globalization and automation are actually complementary. So you need to think about that also. My position.
Yes.
Yeah, I just wondered if you can forecast whether the United States is going to remind that NAFTA was going to be a withdrawal, as with the TPP, considering that 80% of the Mexican production exports to the United States, while we only export to Mexico at 5 times less. So it's more likely to me that Mexico will see right now the attitude by Trump that eventually we will withdraw from NAFTA. What do you think?
Optimistic or pessimistic?
I'm optimistic, at least right now. But the level of uncertainty is so high that I actually we don't really know. It is not good to. It is not a very good way to start any negotiation by threatening. That's not how you start a negotiation. To put your adversary against you. It's a negotiation. You want to actually, it's not you're going to lose and I'm going to be the winner. It is, okay, we all have to win with this. It has to be a win-win.
That's the case. Trump says has to be fairer. It will not be fair.
Yeah, but he's very loose in his terms. Like, what is to be fair in trade? I don't think he knows. I'm sorry. I don't think he knows. He doesn't understand the vocabulary. He doesn't know what is the most favored nation MFN tariff. He doesn't have any idea what it means for consumers to actually be taxed when we import avocados or cars. And then everybody will have to pay 10%, 20% more for every purchase. All the consumer welfare will be wiped out. And also we'll be actually having inflation, interest rate will go up, and it will be absolutely disaster for the economy. The jobs are going to be actually, there is where you are going to see job losses. So I don't think he has a really wide view about how the economy works and how it's interconnected and all the changes that one simple decision may trigger. But I don't know how he's going to wake up tomorrow. Feeling what? What is he's going to be tweeting about? I do believe in the civil servants that are working, and they've been working for a long time and hard in the USTR department. I know some of them. They are the best of the best, lawyers and economists and negotiators. I do think they can put some sense, or they know how to maneuver difficult times. So that's my...
Well,
and now right now I think he's more worried about his his situation within the Congress and what is happening than with trade. I think he's going to be.
But I disagree. That's why he moves it on. He moves it on. I am very optimistic because first, if you notice, Trump was saying NAFTA was the worst trade agreement that we ever signed. And now we see nothing about really withdrawing, and we're negotiating. And yes, he said, oh yeah, well, the U.S. Trade Representative said, well, our manufacturing, we have to renegotiate in manufacturing.
Right.
But I think that when it comes to it, because so many jobs are dependent on this agreement, I think that the agreements are going to be minor and are going to be more on the digital side and on the property rights. I don't think that they will change rule of origins a whole lot because that's a Pandora box. And I think that it would be very difficult for them to renegotiate that.
Jesse, you want to weigh in? Optimistic or negative optimistic?
Optimistic.
Optimistic of what?
So we are three optimistic people.
Well, okay, if the negotiations will go well, yeah, it's dependent on his tweets. Is he gonna blame, the immigrants taking your jobs and the bad hombres bringing drugs in? Barring that doesn't happen, they'll be fine.
Zadia, I have a question for you. A little while, it's a bit technical, so I'm backing up a bit.
I just want to add one thing. You just have to give him some leverage to sell the new NAFTA in a way he can sell it to his constituencies, and then we will be fine. So diplomacy has to be at its finest. And I think Canada and Mexico are doing that very, very, very well. They are not actually getting into conflict with him. They are actually saying, no, we are ready whenever you want. So they are really, really playing softball. So I do think if they will find a way to sell it to him and to reach kind of an equilibrium.
Mexico's attitude is not like, okay, we're going to wait for Mexico's going to move. He wants to wrap it up.
But today, the president already said, we're ready, we are fine with the letter of notification. Whenever you're ready, and Canada, the ministers said the same.
Because Singapore and China is already getting into investment, and Mexico, if that happens.
Well, yeah, the flows of investment are going all around.
Politically, I want to add one important thing. The largest state in terms of Congress in the United States is California. Number 2 is Texas. Number 3 is Florida. They all support NAFTA because of the
We saw the map there, yeah.
You mentioned a little while ago that the labor participation rate had decreased.
Yes, in the U.S.
So therefore, in the U.S., that implies, I believe, that when we hear like yesterday that the unemployment rate is 4.4, very low and reaching the lowest rate, which should be, that's false. That's really, you want to comment on the extent to which a lot of people of working age in the U.S. are outside of the labor force, outside of the labor market.
Yeah, there's for the last 30 years, especially, we're talking men, low-skilled men, they have been dropping out of the labor force at an alarming rate. So basically, when people look at employment over population, and some of the blame is on the lack of higher paying jobs for those people, and because the manufacturing has gone away, and if you only have a high school degree, you have limited on what you have to do. I believe it's also due to the rise of women in the labor force in a way, because some men can actually maintain a certain standard of living if the women are working. But we can't really succeed as an economy if we have so many people not working. So it's a very...
So what would you say the true unemployment rate if we take into account what you're saying?
Well, I don't know, but it's
It'll be
a
higher.
lot higher.
12%.
It's a lot higher. And I think this, there's been some people have theorized that some of this decline in employment rates are linked to this opioid epidemic. Of the large incarceration rates are
Yes, I understand.
population, especially the Black population, because once you have a record, that really hinders your likelihood of getting a job. So we're not sure. There's this debate about how do you figure out why these people are not working. It's very hard to figure exactly, but definitely the lack of good manufacturing jobs is part of it. And how do you train these people when the economy is becoming more and more technical? The jobs that are developing are for people who have more education. So it's a big worry, and there's a lot of people in economics who are actually studying this situation.
You have a very interesting question. One remaining question that I have, big one, well, we can just put on the table and do this later. It seems to me that Nafta is really not the main reason for that loss of jobs, that it is automation, technology, and it is the rise of Asia since the 60s, right? Meaning East Asia first and then China. When some of us are old enough to remember when the US cars, for instance, when no one could compete, and then Toyotas came on board. They were much better than American cars. So that was expansion of Asia. I mean, those two forces, and you deal with that just in an interesting way. It seems to me that the main forces changing the world in the US, so-called globalization, have to do with automation and with China, the rise of East Asia. We're coming down a time. To what extent is Nafta really a minor?
I totally agree. It's a minor. It's a minor component of the job losses. We saw it's not even 600,000 American jobs. So compared to the large labor market, that's nothing. Individually, it's a huge loss. So what we need is distributional policies, retraining policies that actually they have not been working in the United States. They have been very successful in Europe. There is a program to actually retrain workers that they have lost their jobs due to a link to trade. But that program here, we have same program as in Europe, it is not working at all. We don't train them well. We actually don't help them to move because, people have to migrate to other states where there are more jobs. We don't help them in the transition. We don't. Our unemployment benefits are not really. How could I say this politely? They are not very generous. So our trade displacement program is actually one of the worst in the Western civilization. So that's one of the main issues. Our distributional policies are one of the worst also compared to Germany, compared to France, compared to Israel. Therefore, we have some displacements, some losses due to trade, but we are not helping that people. Because those people have mortgages. We need to help them, to get different skills, very advanced skills. The new jobs are not coming back in manufacturing terms, or those, if they are coming back, they are not going to be in the same place that they were before. So we need to actually help them to migrate and to find those jobs, etc. And that's safety net, and we are not very well known because we implement that safety net. And another thing I would like to say is that automation and technological change has caused a big loss in especially for low-skilled workers, but it has created huge amount of jobs, but in other areas. So for every job loss, 3 has been created due to technology. Now, we need software engineers. 50 50 years ago, we didn't need them. Now we need programmers. Now we need people managing big data. So the jobs that are, job creation is there. That's why we have 4.4 unemployment rate, but it's a different kind of job creation. Technology has facilitated all these all of these jobs, but those are more medium, high-skill jobs. What we need to have is a program in place to help those that don't have those skills to actually get them and to migrate, to find those jobs. Because I mean, if you have those skills, but you are still stuck in that state, which doesn't have anything to offer, then it doesn't help at all to have all those skills.
A related question, the North American economy, is it more productive now with the supply chains, with Nafta?
Yes, than it was in 1994, yes, definitely.
In my view, we wouldn't have Ford, Chrysler, and GM if it wasn't for Nafta. Basically, we bailed them out, yes, in the recession. But basically, if we did not do Nafta, they wouldn't be able to survive internationally. And that was one of Marta's points. You know, we're in a competitive, international competitive world, and we're not the only ones selling cars. So that's
So either we have something like that, like NAFTA, or we lose to get more competitiveness.
Yes.
Right?
Yeah, and then macroeconomic policies have to be there to.
Well, again, these are great questions. We'll pursue them again in the future. We look forward to seeing all of you, and we thank you, and we thank you. Thank you.